So, ladies and gentlemen, our second speaker of the morning, after John's excellent opening, please pay attention for Alina Boshchenko. Thank you, Alina.
Hey. Thank you for introducing me. Hi everyone, thank you for joining this session. Today we're going to talk about the OAuth 2.0 extension called PKCE and how it protects the native clients. Well, first of all, I would like to start with a brief introduction of the OAuth 2.0 flow itself. I'm pretty sure that a lot of you are already familiar with this, but I want everyone to be just on the same page before we get to the actual attack scenarios. Also, please note as today we're going to talk really a lot about OAuth 2.0. Sometimes just for the matter of convenience, I'm going to say OAuth. Please note that by it, I always mean OAuth 2.0. And let's start. Interesting. I feel like something is not working. I'm sorry, I had some technical problems. Yeah, sorry for this small break. Well, first of all, OAuth 2.0 is a certification framework which kind of became a standard for the federated authentication. Of course, there are other means of providing federated authentication, but they are way less generic. So, for example, if you take SML protocol, it would be way more enterprise-oriented. And OAuth 2.0 aims to establish a trusted relationship between the resource owner, who is typically a user, the client app, which is seeking access, authorization server, and the server holding the resources. And there are several possible OAuth 2.0 flows. We're going to discuss it in detail a bit later, but the scheme on slide shows just the very general concept. So when the user wants to authorize a certain application to get access to the resources, it first gets redirected to the consent form and authentication form provided by the authorization server. When user authenticates themselves and grants a certain consent to give certain permissions to the client app, authorization server issues an access token, which can later be used to get access to the resources. And the killer feature here is the lifespan of the access token. Because do you actually remember when was the last time you changed the password of your, let's say, Google account? Well, if you follow the best practices, probably it wasn't such a long time ago, but still, the lifespan of the access token is relatively half an hour, so it's way less. And it lowers the chances of it being compromised. And now let's switch to a particular flow, which is the authorization code flow. In this flow, the user wants to access the application, it initiates the authorization flow, and then the client application calls the authorization server in order to get redirection form. The auth server replies with a redirection form where user authenticates themselves, grants all the required permissions, and if permissions are granted, then the authorization server issues the auth code, which later can be exchanged by calling the token endpoint to the access token. And then, if everything is okay, the auth server validates the client ID of the application, the code, issues the token, and later this token can be used to get access to the resources. And please note that according to all the specifications, here all the communication should be performed only over the secure channels such as TLS. And now we want to focus more on this part, which is particularly responsible for the exchange of auth code to access token. And the most logical question here is, why the hell so complicated? Why can't we just immediately issue a token? And the answer is pretty straightforward. If you take a look at arrows 2, 3, and 6, we can notice that here the logic is performed over HTTP redirects, meaning that the browser is involved here. And in browser, it's actually not easy to keep anything secret because, well, technically we can add token to URLs, let's say, but any proxy or reverse proxy will happily write everything to logs, so anyone who has access to those logs will be able to see all the information. An alternative could be headers, however, it's the same problem, everything is still visible. Therefore, we need the one-time access code, which has a lifespan even shorter than a token, which reduces even more the attack surface. And here, why it works, basically because the request to exchange the code to token is performed from backend to backend. So no HTTP redirects are involved here, no browser is involved here. And also we are in control of the network where those backends are located. Another interesting point here is that at step 6, how would the OAuth server know where to redirect back the authorization code? Because, well, technically, I can construct a URL which would impersonate the client app. OAuth arises at OAuth server and instructs the server to return the code to, let's say, my personal server. And, well, to avoid this, we basically need to create a certain list of allowed addresses where it's valid to return a code or token for every client application and maintain this list. But how those redirects look like? Well, on the picture and slide, we see the very typical case. You've probably seen this like millions of times when you click on a certain link and you get redirected to the application instead of opening it in the browser. And some operating systems allow to claim a certain URL patterns by applications, meaning that if you access these URL patterns, instead of opening the browser window, you're going to open the application. An alternative could be generating so-called custom URL schemes. Facebook, for example, uses this approach. They generate a custom scheme based on the client ID of the application. And an alternative to this one could be reverse domain. So let's say if you're in control of the domain appexample.com, you reverse it in the manner of com.example.app, and you can use this as a custom scheme. However, a scheme such as my app wouldn't work well in this case because we aim to make those schemes as globally unique as possible. Why we need this? Well, the limitation of this approach, or a feature, you call it, is that multiple applications could register the very same custom scheme. And in this case, it would be really hard to determine which application will receive the authorization. And when applications want to register itself as a custom handler for the custom schemes, they typically interact with operating system configuration files or APIs. For example, on Android, you need to register an intent filter in the manifest file, basically claiming that you are able to handle incoming requests with this particular scheme. And note that actually here, this functionality is essential for the legitimate app's communication, so it's definitely like a feature. What is interesting here is that even according to the official OAuth flow, several apps can even split the responsibility. So one application, for example, calls the authorization endpoint, and another one handles the code and token. So it's not prohibited by the flow. But later, we will see how this feature can become a perfect surface for the code interception attack. So 8 minutes later, what is PKCE? PKCE stands for the proof key of code exchange. It's basically an extension of the OAuth2.0, which was designed to protect native clients against the authorization code interception attack. And then I'll start with a small spoiler. In this attack, an attacker manages to install the malicious application which registers itself as the handler for the very custom scheme as the good app uses. And after this, it's capable of intercepting the authorization code returned by the OAuth server and then capable of exchanging it with the access token. And now let's see in details how it is possible. Well, in this attack, the user initiates the authorization flow and tries to access the application. The application sends an authorization request, which is forwarded to the authorization server. Then the user is presented with the authentication form, with the consent form, and if the user grants all the required permissions to the client app, the OAuth server can issue an OAuth code. And the OAuth code is forwarded to the application via operating system or browser. But recall, we managed as an attacker to install this malicious app which registered the very same custom scheme. And in this case, if for some reason the priority of this application would be higher than the goods app priority, then the authorization code will be forwarded to this application. And we can easily get the access token. And you could stop me at this moment asking like, well, we can't do anything with this access code while we don't have client credentials, right? But in fact, sometimes we can easily get client credentials as well. Because if your application is a mobile app or let's say single page app, then chances are that you're using the same client ID for every instance of the app. Those apps are called public clients. It's a separate class of apps, and in those apps, we can't actually trust the secret, and it's highly recommended not to perform any logic by trusting the secret because we can't actually ensure that this value is kept confidential. So we can assume that here we can have the client ID as well. So here's the problem. If you have this kind of public client and you're using authorization code flow, then some imposter might be generating and using the access tokens without you even know. And what we could do with this? Well, the major idea behind PKCE is so-called proof of possession. The main idea is that client application should give a proof to the authorization server that the code it's presenting actually belongs to it. And how we can ensure this? By adding some new values. First of all, the client app should generate a 32-octet sequence, which is output of the random numbers generator. This value is secret. It's, of course, important to ensure that it's hardly predictable. And then it's been encoded with the base 64. This way, we receive the value of code verifier. The code verifier is then hashed using code challenge method, which is in like 19% cases SHA-256. And we receive a new sequence, which is later encoded again using base 64. And we receive a new value of code challenge. So now we have 3 new values. How are we going to use this? First of all, when the client application makes the very first request to authorize on our server, we need to include, apart from other parameters, the values of code challenge and code challenge method. Those values are stored alongside with the client ID in the authorization server and can be used later. Then we perform the rest of the flow, and here we got the code, and we want to exchange this code to the token. And in this request, apart from other parameters, we include the value of the code verifier. And when this request reaches the server, it's able to perform the checks if the code actually belongs to this client app. We already have the code challenge stored on server, and now we can hash and encode the code verifier value and check if they equal. If it's a match, then the token is issued and the access can be later granted. This works because code verifier and code challenge cannot be intercepted, as remember we work over the TLS secure connection. And also it's crucial to ensure that code challenge value is not exactly the same as a code verifier, because otherwise anyone again who has access to logs, for example, will be able to see, and it's going to be no point in using PKCE here. Also this pair should be generated each time the authorization request is sent, meaning that this pair should be generated once per authorization. So this way, we kind of bind together the client application and the OAuth code, and we mitigate this kind of attack. But what are the actual limitations of this approach? Well, let me introduce you a PKCE bypass via app impersonation attack. In this attack, let's say we managed to install a naval application on user device. We also managed to register a custom scheme for like the same as the legitimate app, and also we managed to steal the client credentials. What could be done next? Well, the malicious application now initiates the flow. It makes the authorization request, including the client ID and redirection URL of the good application, this way pretending to be it. Apart from this, it can also generate the code challenge method, and code verifier, and includes the first 2 values in the request. Then the flow goes as usual, and we assume that the user is authenticated and grants access for the application. Remember, like the evil app pretends to be the good app. And later, when we want to exchange the code to the token, nothing stops evil app from sending the valid code verifier value here. And because, well, that was the application that generated all 3 values. And this way, we also receive the token. So can we actually consider PKCE tricked here? Well, both yes and no, actually, because for this attack to be successful, we do need to ensure that several very important conditions are fulfilled. First of all, we need to ensure that the evil app has higher priority when handling the same redirect URI. It's possible, we could do this. But what is even more important, we also need to get client credentials. And yeah, I said before that there are high chances that the client would be public, but it's not always the case, and sometimes in several applications, the client credentials are generated per application instance. So for this case, it would require traffic sniffing, which significantly complicates the attack. But the most important point here is the following. Let's take a look at those two attacks. What is the first thing that actually catches the eye, which is different? Well, obviously enough, that's the user. And the thing is that in the very first attack that led to the development of PKCE, the user was the one who initiated the OAuth flow. And of course, if you initiate this, you kind of expect to receive all those like authentication forms, all those consent forms, etc., etc. But here, in this attack, it was the evil app who initiated the flow. And this way, PKCE introduced a very important additional step for the attack to be successful. We need to trick the user to authorize the access to requested resources. So we need to also include some phishing techniques here. And of course, all those steps, they do not completely mitigate this attack, but they make it way more complex, and they reduce the effect. And let's stop on ways of mitigations for a bit longer here. Well, as I said, yeah, we could potentially steal the client ID. We can potentially register the custom scheme with a higher priority, but we still need to trick the user to sign in. And also, depending on the type of the native app, we also have a couple of more ways of mitigation. So, for example, for mobile, you could use the claim HTTPS schemes to resolve the redirects URI problem. It's backed by application links on the Android and universal links on iOS. Basically, this means that the authorization code can be directed only to the application which has proved the possession of a certain domain via deep linking registration process. However, on desktop, the situation is actually a bit more complicated because only loopbacks and private URI schemes are allowed. And it's more relies on user to avoid installing the malicious malware because, well, it's generally considered that if you manage to install the malicious app, well, probably you have way deeper problems than just authentication. But as an advice on a good practice, as usual, it could be like installing the applications from the trusted source, which require code signing. In this way, user at least knows who the publisher is. And let's conclude on some notes on the best practices. So first of all, for the refresh tokens, it's best to use PKCE in conjunction with the refresh token rotation, which basically means that every time you use refresh token to get the access token, the new refresh token should be generated as well. Also, a bit of context here, there are two different kinds of user agents. The external user agent is usually the device native browser, while the embedded user agent is a browser integrated in a certain application. And according to the best practices, native apps must not use embedded user agents to perform auth requests, and authorization endpoints even may take steps to detect and block such requests. And the reasoning behind this is the following. Well, even if the application is provided by the same party as a, let's say, authorization server, the embedded user agents violates the whole principle of the least privilege because it gets access to the whole authentication profile of the user, not only the credentials that are intended for this authorization flow. So it kind of ruins the whole OAuth2.0 thing. And also, it's not possible for every architecture, for every kind of mobile app or desktop app, but if possible, try to use the different clients ID and secrets per application instance, because then, to get the credentials, it would require traffic sniffing, which significantly complicates the whole story of attacking. And also, as I mentioned in the very beginning, there are several possible flows for the OAuth2.0. We considered the code grant today. But for example, those flows which do not require the usual user consent, for example, client credentials flow, they shouldn't be used for native clients, even with PKCE, because, well, if user doesn't even grant the consent, then we are in a big trouble here. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that in the recent years, PKCE became a really standard not only for native applications, it's widely adopted, it's supported by all major OAuth 2.0 providers, and it provides an additional layer of protection against code interception and unauthorized access. So actually, the development of PKCE made a huge contribution to the security of authentication, authorization on native clients, but even it can become a silver bullet. And of course, like we all see this every day, and we're going to see it even more in the 2 upcoming days of conference, that no system is perfectly secure, but we can at least try to make it a bit better. Thank you a lot for your attention. I don't think we have time for a question, but feel free to approach me, and I wish you a great conference. Thank you.
Alina, thank you very, very much.
Thanks.